Thank you all for coming on behalf of the Chicago Lawyers Chapter of the American Constitution Society, the ACLU of Illinois, and SCAD and ARPS. We're really happy that you all could come on this freezing cold day and join us for a great program. If you're not familiar with ACS, it is a nonprofit legal organization with progressive values. Check out our website. We also are offering a CLE credit today. So if you signed up outside for CLE credit and you picked up a packet of information, there are also evaluations of the program on your table. It would be very helpful if you could take the time to fill those out at the end. We will also be emailing those of you who signed up the 300-plus page report that the group published. We figured it was better to email than send you home with a couple pounds of paper. And I guess I'll introduce our great speaker. We have the privilege of having Professor Stone with us today. He teaches at the University of Chicago Law School. He's also the co-chair of our Board of Advisors for the ACS Lawyers Chapter, as well as a member of ACLU. And this past fall, he was invited to be one of 5 members of the President's Review Group on the NSA data collection practices. Had a crazy schedule, worked an enormous amount, and put together that huge report that I was just mentioning. So we are lucky enough that he is here to share his experience with us, his conclusions, his insights. Professor Stone.
Thank you, Alexis. I'm delighted to be here. This event brings together 3 of my favorite organizations. I've been on the national board, chair of the national board of the American Constitution Society, been a member of the National Advisory Council of the ACLU for 25 years, and SCAD and ARPS as the SCAD and Fellowship Program, which is one of the great public interest fellowship programs in the country. So I'm particularly pleased to have the opportunity to be here, and also to see so many people here who are my long-standing friends, which explains why they sold out. So what I'll do is to talk a bit about the process of the review group, because it's interesting, and then I'll talk a bit about a few of the issues that we addressed and what kind of recommendations we made, and then what we might expect with respect to those issues in the future. And then I'll leave plenty of time for questions. I'm told by Alexis that we should plan on staying. I'll plan on staying until 1:15, but you're obviously free to leave whenever you like. So in mid-August, I got a phone call from the White House out of the blue. This was at the height of the Snowden revelations, inviting me to serve on this review group that was being created to look into NSA surveillance practices. I was told by the president it would be a 5-member group, and we'd get started pretty soon. I'd need a top-secret clearance. I laughed and told him that was highly unlikely, but I agreed to come and see what the deal was. And of course, I knew I had to say yes, although I really did hope I wasn't going to get the clearance, and therefore I'd be moot. And in fact, when it came time to go through this clearance review, I rather eagerly told the investigator that last summer my brother, who lives in Maine and had cancer, had medical marijuana, and that I had happily joined him in smoking it illegally, from my standpoint, and she wasn't impressed. So at the outset, there were 5 of us on this group, and it was a very interesting group of individuals, very diverse backgrounds, experience, values, predilections about these types of issues. In addition to myself, a sort of traditional civil liberties type, there was Michael Morell, who was 30 years at the CIA, former deputy director and acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He'd stepped down from the CIA only a few months before, and I have to say he was not thrilled to suddenly be asked to volunteer his time and to go back and do all this stuff, having just stepped down from the CIA. But he came to this with a very deep understanding and appreciation of the CIA's activities and the intelligence community. Another member was Richard Clark. Clark was a former member of the National Security Council. He'd spent many years at very high levels in the Defense Department and the State Department, and was fairly well versed in technology issues, and he also came to this very much from an inside the government perspective, with long experience and exposure to these issues with respect to national security questions. A third additional member was Peter Swyer. Peter is a professor at Georgia Tech. He was head of the Office of Privacy and Information Technology in the Clinton administration and is a specialist in issues of privacy and technology questions. And the fourth member was my former colleague at the University of Chicago Law School for many years, Cass Sunstein. He most recently served for several years, 4 years during the president's first term of office as director of the Office of Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Management and Budget, and just recently stepped down from that position to return to full-time teaching at Harvard. So we're a very odd group. Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, described us at one point as this was like taking 5 highly egotistical, high testosterone guys, throwing them in a room together and telling them nobody's in charge. And that captures very nicely what this was like. So our first meeting was in the Situation Room with the President and with Susan Rice and with other members of the administration, charging us, in fact, this was in late August, charging us with our task, which was to look in a completely independent way. Independent was underscored many times by the President in the meeting, and to make recommendations to him about how we deal with these issues and how we can improve them, and particularly how we can restore public trust. In this meeting, the President made clear that our charge was not to examine the legal questions, that is what the government is doing legal or constitutional? Several of us were not lawyers, that was not the setup, but rather to address the question, assuming it's legal to do what we're doing, should we do it? And are there better ways to strike the balance between privacy and national security than the ways we're doing it now? So the group went off, and the very first meeting we had among ourselves, we were assigned an office in a SCIF, a secure facility. So you could only enter this facility if you had top secret clearance. And we spent most of the next 4.5 months in that room. We were there every week, typically from Sunday to Wednesday or Thursday. And during the course of that time, we had regular meetings with the heads of the NSA, the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, with the staff of all of those different organizations. We had several meetings with people in the White House on a regular basis, including particularly Susan Rice and Lisa Monaco and Kathy Rumler, the White House counsel. We met with various congressional committees, the House Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, as well as with many individual members of Congress who wanted to meet with us. We met with representatives from the telecom companies who had an interest in some of these issues, with internet companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook and Yahoo and the like, with representatives of the European Union, and with private civil liberties and privacy organizations. So a lot of our time was spent simply listening to people and hearing what they had to say, listening to their advice. We met with judges from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and registering all this, while at the same time trying to absorb all that information and all of the various contexts in which these issues arose. For me, this was, I think, particularly daunting, because of the 5 of us, I was the one with the least, indeed with no, internal government experience. And therefore, I found from day one that I didn't know what the hell anybody was talking about. As any of you who've worked in government know, no sentence passes without an acronym. And I found myself in the first several weeks absolutely frustrated by the fact that people were continually referencing things like NIST and DARPA, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And I sort of constantly had to sort of raise my hand and say, excuse me, what is that, right? And that was really sort of annoying. After about 2 weeks, I made a list of 279 acronyms, which I had not ever heard before, and sat down and tried to memorize them. And after about 6, I said, this is ridiculous. I can't do this. I give up. And so my compatriots actually were very good about realizing that I needed a glossary. And so whenever they used these acronyms, they'd caught themselves, and they would say, Jeff, this is what this is. So and the other aspect of it was that I had no familiarity with any of the statutory or legal framework inside these organizations. That is, I knew about the Fourth Amendment, I knew about the First Amendment, I didn't know anything about the various statutory provisions and administrative provisions and Department of Justice provisions that governed all this. So there's a huge learning curve here from day one. When I was in Chicago, when we were not in D.C., I could never work on this project from home or from the office because I was dealing constantly with top secret materials. So the only place I could ever work on it was in a special secure facility in the FBI field office down on Roosevelt Road, where I would spend most of my time when I was in Chicago and not in D.C. So it was it was like being in a cave for 4.5 months in which everything else sort of disappeared. And you had to be completely absorbed by this experience. And in the course of it, we had to also produce what wound up being a 310-page report, which we all wrote, and I wrote about half of it. So it was a completely absorbing and complex and challenging experience. And the range of issues we had to deal with was enormous. So to some extent, we brought to bear our respective expertise, which was useful. But one of the most interesting things about this at the personal level, and one of the most fascinating things about it, is that when we began in the very first meeting, we discussed two questions. First of all, should we have a chair? And Richard Clark said, we don't need a chair. And we all agreed that makes sense. And so we didn't have a chair. The second question is, what do we do when we disagree? Right? This is the very beginning of the process. How do we want to deal with that? Do we want to have dissenting opinions in the report? Do we want to simply note that a majority of the committee agrees with this, but not everybody? And we decided to put that off and worry about it later. In fact, we made 46 highly complicated recommendations, which include many subparts, so there's probably 300 or 400 recommendations in total. And we were unanimous on every one. And this was amazing. At the personal level, this experience was truly unprecedented for me. I mean, you take these 5 very smart people, very strong views, the idea that Mike Morell, the CIA guy, and I would agree on anything seemed implausible from the beginning. But you throw these 5 guys in this cave, and you completely absorb them in trying to understand these issues and talk them through. And they develop a real respect for one another and a trust in one another. And over time, the ability to talk these things through, to argue them out, to think about them, to come back, to write, to rewrite. We ultimately were unanimous on every one of our recommendations. And that was not about deferring. It was not about, I'll give you this one if you give me that one. We simply talked everything through to the point where we actually all agreed with each of the recommendations. That was a remarkable thing. It was really an extraordinary experience to have in one's life. And I came, and I think all of us came, to have great, as I say, respect and admiration for one another by the time the process was over. Okay, so that's a bit of what the process was like. And it was pretty heavy duty. So a little bit about some of the issues. So these 46 recommendations covered a broad range of questions. And I think I'll focus on 3 or 4 of them here, which are the ones that have gotten the most attention and are the most interesting to the American public generally. But first, a little background. Until the late 1970s, foreign intelligence surveillance was completely unregulated by law. The basic assumption was that the executive, the president, had complete autonomy to engage in foreign intelligence surveillance, whether in the United States or abroad, without any judicial oversight. The reason for this was partly an assumption that this was the president's job. It was not the Congress's job. It was not the judiciary's job. This was part of the commander-in-chief responsibility. And the second part of it, for not having any judicial oversight, was because judges were not in a position to have any role in this, because when you're dealing with classified information, judges for the most part, federal judges for the most part, are not capable of dealing with classified information. They don't live in secure facilities. Their law clerks, their secretaries, their messengers, the people in their building are not cleared to have access to top secret material. And so you couldn't allow ordinary courts to have any involvement in what were classified investigations. And so basically until the late 1970s, the assumption was that this is entirely for the president without any oversight or supervision by anybody else. In the late 70s, as the revelations of the abuses from the 60s and early 70s from the FBI and the NSA and the CIA and the Army intelligence came to light in the Nixon administration and the Johnson administration, Congress decided there was a need to have some oversight of these activities. And it created, in 1978, it passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that act created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And what the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act did was to provide that when the government engaged in surveillance activities in the United States for foreign intelligence purposes, if it was engaging in, say, a wiretap, it needed to get a warrant from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court on a showing of probable cause to believe that the target of the wiretap was an agent of a foreign power that included international terrorism, and that there was probable cause to believe that the surveillance would produce relevant evidence to shed light on foreign intelligence purposes. This was the first time that any effort had been made to bring the activities of foreign intelligence within the domain of judicial oversight. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was established, and the way Congress did that, this is the Church Committee, which recommended all these various reforms. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court would consist of regular sitting federal district court judges who would be appointed for 7-year terms by the Chief Justice of the United States to serve on the FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And they would serve a few weeks a year in Washington, D.C. They would come to D.C. and they'd operate out of this secure facility, which was the court, in which they would hear all of the various classified information relevant to whether this surveillance satisfied the requirements of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that court operated and operates to this day in that matter. The existence of the court is public, always has been. The judges who sit on it is public, always has been. But what the court deals with is classified information, and therefore traditionally its proceedings are classified and its opinions are classified. They are reviewed by both the Attorney General and by the House, Senate, and Intelligence Committees, the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, but the public does not have access traditionally to any of the activities or review decisions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Okay, so that operated reasonably well in most people's view until 9/11. After 9/11, things began to change, because one thing that the government realized is that it had missed connecting the dots. That 9/11 was a disaster, and we did not want to have more 9/11s in the future. And the question is, what can we do to avoid the mistakes we made in not anticipating the terrorist attack of September 11th, 2001? And to that end, over a period of years, both the executive branch and the Congress dealt with this question of how to redefine intelligence activities, foreign intelligence activities, so as to better ensure that we would be able to prevent these attacks in the future. And the reasons for wanting to prevent these attacks were obvious and manifold. Not only was it a concern about the actual deaths and destruction and economic effects, but also the recognition that if we were to have these attacks, it would decimate civil liberties in the United States, because the consequence would be to have ever more surveillance and ever more restrictions on American freedom. So one of the important reasons to prevent this was not only national security in the simple sense, it was also to preserve civil liberties in the United States in the future. Okay, so a lot of things happened in the law after 9/11, and what I'll do is talk about a couple of them. So one thing that Congress did was enact Section 215 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And Section 215 of the Act authorizes the FBI and the NSA to obtain orders from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that require third parties, credit card companies, banks, telephone companies, and the like, to turn over records to the NSA, we'll stick with the NSA here to make it simple, to the NSA upon a showing that such information is relevant to a foreign intelligence investigation, and that the person whose records are sought is someone who there is reasonable ground to believe is involved in such activity. In effect, this was a bit like a subpoena. But the difference is that because a subpoena is not classified, there needed to be some way to enable the NSA to get information through a classified mechanism. And so Section 215 was created to enable the court to issue these essentially subpoenas, these orders that provided information to the NSA and then ultimately to the FBI and other organizations to acquire foreign intelligence surveillance information. And there are constitutional issues that one might think about with respect to this, and I can talk about that later, but I'm going to stick for the moment with the report, which wasn't focused on those issues. Okay, so until 2006 or so, Section 215 was used exclusively in the way it was originally understood, which was to get an individual's phone records or an individual's bank records or an individual's credit card records when there was reason to believe that that person was involved in terrorist activity. In the same way that a prosecutor could issue a subpoena to get similar information in the drug investigation. Indeed, it was even more demanding than a subpoena because a subpoena doesn't have to go through a court, whereas Section 215 required that the FISC approve these orders. Okay, so then what happened in 2006 is with advancing technology, the NSA went to the FISC and asked for an order that allowed it to do something that went way beyond what had ever previously been done. It basically asked for the court to allow it to issue an order to telephone service providers requiring them to turn over metadata of individuals who use those service providers. So metadata, in simple terms, is the calling records. Who each individual calls, who calls them. Phone records, basically. No names are connected to it. It's simply data, phone number, every person, every number that calls that number, every number that number is called. And the argument was this is relevant to foreign intelligence surveillance because we want this database so that when we know somebody or when we suspect somebody is a terrorist, we want to be able to connect the dots. We want to know who they're talking to and who the people they're talking to are talking to. So what the metadata, the Section 215 telephone metadata program did is essentially this. It allowed the NSA to collect this metadata about millions of individuals to put it in a huge database. The NSA had no access to that database, no legal access to that database for any purpose unless two analysts working for the NSA independently determined that there was a particular phone number that was associated with an individual engaged in terrorism, almost always a person outside the United States. If two analysts independently determined that a particular phone number was associated with an individual engaged in terrorism, then a supervisor would review their determinations and would again independently determine that there was reasonable and articulable suspicion that that phone number was being used by a terrorist. Upon that finding, the NSA was allowed to query the database with that phone number and would then learn the phone number of every person who that person was in touch with. That was called the first hop. So, for example, and the data could be kept for 5 years. So, for example, if the average person calls 100 people in the course of, or is called by 100 people in the course of 5 years, they would have access to 100 numbers, right? And what they were looking for is any of those numbers also a number that we suspect to be associated with a person engaged in terrorism. Now, it's important to note, they never saw the 100 numbers. The only thing they saw was any other number that they'd already put into the computer that was identified with someone associated with terrorism. So if the first hop, if none of the 100 people were engaged in terrorism, they saw nothing. They just got 0. Right? So they didn't actually see the numbers that the people were talking to. They only saw the numbers that people were talking to if the other person was also suspected of terrorism. Then they could do a second hop, which meant that they could then see who the 100 people had communicated with, the phone numbers those 100 people communicated with over the past 5 years. So if every person on average calls 100 people, they would have 100 times 100, or 10,000, a pool of 10,000. Again, they did not see any of the numbers unless one of those 10,000 was a person independently suspected of terrorism. Okay, so that's how the Section 215 program operated. In 2012, the last year for which we had full data, the NSA queried the database on 288 occasions. That is, at 288 phone numbers that it had identified as reasonable or articulable suspicion were associated with terrorism. Those 288 queries produced 16 matches. So on 16 instances, a number popped out on the first or the second hop that said that person has been directly or indirectly in touch with another number which is associated with, which we believe to be associated with terrorism. Upon receiving that connection, the NSA would turn the data over to the FBI, who would then initiate an investigation to determine whether there was a conspiracy between these individuals. The rationale of the program was clear. Right? The idea is to figure out, is somebody out there who we're worried about talking to somebody here we're worried about, in which case alarm bells go off. And it's time to investigate and figure out if there's anything more going on. Okay, of those 16 tips, none of them turned out to be particularly productive. That is, in all 16 of them, the investigation turned up no information that was important in the ability of the government to thwart a terrorist attack. Okay, so that's basically how the Section 215 program operates. One question for us was, is this acceptable? And we made 3 recommendations in particular about this. Understanding how it operated, I should add one other thing. In the past, the program had several non-compliance issues. That is, the FISA court on several occasions learned from the NSA. NSA, when they learned of these non-compliance, reported it to the FISA court, that the analysts or others in the process had screwed up. And they'd swept in numbers they shouldn't have been looking at. And the FISA court, when this happened in what was originally classified opinions, was really pissed and took the NSA to task. And the NSA then corrected the problems that had existed, and the FISA court then said, okay, you're back in business. Okay, so we made basically 3 recommendations. First and most important one is we concluded that the NSA should not be allowed to hold the data. That even if the program operates as it is supposed to operate, and even if that itself is acceptable, given that it serves a potentially legitimate purpose, it's indeed potentially important purpose, that the great danger here, is that at some point, individuals in the government will abuse the data. That they will use it not for the specific purpose for which it is created and authorized, but for political purposes, for personal purposes, and there could always be another J. Edgar Hoover, another Richard Nixon, and the metadata can tell an awful lot about individuals. Who they call, whether they have a psychiatrist, whether they're gay, whether they are having an affair, all sorts of information you can discern from this if you get the raw data and you want to investigate a particular individual. And so one thing we recommended is that the data should no longer be held by the NSA or by the government. That instead, the data should be held either with the service providers, with the phone companies, or if that proves to be inefficient, as it would probably be, but not necessarily so, then to create a separate independent private entity that would hold the database from which the NSA, with court orders, would be allowed to query the information. But the idea there is to both take it out of the government, reduce the probability that it would be abused in this way by public officials, and to put another third set of eyes, an independent set of eyes on the database. So if it is being abused, somebody will see this. That was one recommendation. Second recommendation was that the NSA should not be allowed to query the data without a court order. That is, the analysts and the supervisor, not sufficient. The FISC should decide in every instance, in every one of the 288 instances, whether there is, in fact, reasonable and articulable suspicion, rather than leaving it to the NSA analysts. Not, by the way, to say that the analysts did a particularly bad job. Their decisions were reviewed regularly by the Attorney General and by the intelligence committees, but nonetheless, we saw no good reason not to have a court intervene in this. And the third recommendation we made is that the data should be held no longer than 2 years, because it turns out it does get stale, and the NSA couldn't really persuasively argue that it needed to hold the data for more than 2 years. Now, what's interesting about this program is that it's actually much more targeted even than I suggested, because for a couple of reasons. First of all, the NSA does not, in fact, gather all the phone records of everybody in the United States, which is the way it's been portrayed in the media. In fact, it actually gathers, the number is classified, so I can't say it, but a small percentage of the total pool of data. Part of this is for sensible, substantive reasons. You don't need the numbers of call Pizza Hut. And to the extent you can screen them out, that saves everybody trouble. But also, it's expensive. And at our meeting at the NSA early on in this process, when we talked to the NSA about the program and they explained it all to us in detail and we questioned them and so on, they said to us they only bring in a relatively small percentage of the total. And we said, why? Because logically, given the nature of this program, you'd think you'd want the whole shebang, right? And they said, basically, it's expensive. And, given competing demands on resources, we can't afford to do the whole thing. And, it's just a little bit like saying you've got 12 haystacks, right? You're only going to look in one. Now, looking in one is better than looking in none, but it's a little odd to do that. Okay, so the value of the program, the fact that the NSA doesn't use it for the whole shebang indicates that their commitment to the program is tentative. The fact that it hasn't yet produced critical information, not only in that 1 year, but in the 6 years it's existed, is also suggests maybe it's not critical. On the other hand, the NSA argues, look, when you're looking for needles in haystacks and when you're talking about preventing, not the Boston Marathon bombing, but 9/11 or a nuclear attack or a chemical attack or a biological attack, then if you find one every 20 years, it's a big deal. And that's what we're looking for. Right? So the fact that we haven't found anything in 6 or 7 years, that's not the end of the world. What we're looking for is the one thing that really makes a huge difference, and this program can do that. Okay, so that's the Section 215 program. Before I go to the other two, I'll say a little bit more about what happened with this. So this was our recommendation. We met with the president in mid-December when we turned in our report, and the indication he gave us then was that he thought these were sensible recommendations and was inclined to adopt them. Then over the course of the next month, he met with all of the persons in the government, in the intelligence community, to get their input on all these things. And on Wednesday, January 15th, I forget the exact date, 2 days before the president's speech, the New York Times, the Washington Post run a story, obviously leaked by the White House, that the president is not going to require court orders and is not going to take it out of the hands of the NSA. We had a meeting that afternoon with Susan Rice and other leading officials in the administration, not the president, to talk to us about the speech. And we told them that's bullshit. Independent, you want independent, you got independent, right? We told them in no uncertain terms, this is not to happen. It's not our call, but it's a mistake. It's a mistake on the merits, and it's a mistake politically. If the president wants to restore the trust of the American people, if he goes out and says the 215 metadata program is pretty cool, I like it, it's going to be a disaster. And happily, 2 days later when he gave a speech, he basically endorsed our recommendations. Now, what will exactly happen remains to be seen. Congress has to act. So the president can't do all of this on his own. He can't solve all these problems on his own, but he clearly endorsed the recommendations. Okay, second thing I'll do quickly. Another thing that was created after 9/11 were national security letters. National security letters authorized the FBI to, on its own, issue the equivalent of subpoenas to, again, banks, credit card companies, telephone companies, and the like, demanding that they turn over to the FBI information relevant to national security investigations. And unlike the Section 215 metadata program, the FBI uses NSLs, national security letters, more than 20,000 times a year. And we looked at this program, and we concluded that the FBI should not be allowed to do this without a court order. That just as Section 215 itself requires a court order, that the NSL program should require a court order. Jim Comey, a former student of mine, who's the head of the FBI now, argued vehemently against us in a meeting we had with him that this was inefficient, it would be problematic, and subpoenas don't require a court order. A prosecutor can issue a subpoena. Why can't the FBI issue a subpoena in the same way? Why put the FBI, when it's investigating terrorist investigations, under greater restraints than when it's investigating drug investigations, drug crimes? And our answer to that is that there's a big difference between the subpoena and the NSL. Subpoenas are not secret. And therefore, there is an external review of the use of subpoenas, whereas NSLs are classified for 50 years. The party who receives the NSL cannot reveal to anyone the fact that it was received, and the parties who are affected by the NSLs are not told of their existence. So we said that's a huge difference. These are not like subpoenas, right? Section 215 had it right. Congress was right. There should be a court order here, and there should be a court order for NSLs. On this issue, the president rejected our recommendation, accepted the argument of the FBI that a court order would be inefficient, and we've said there should be an emergency exception, by the way, but it would be inefficient, and did suggest that there would be some modifications of the way NSLs are handled to enhance a bit more of the transparency, but basically rejected the idea of a court order. Third thing I'll mention is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So when the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was created, it was basically to deal with probable cause decisions. That is, the government was going to come to it and say, we want to do a wiretap in the United States of somebody who we believe is engaged in terrorist activity, and it has to be classified, so we go to the FISC, and you'll decide if there's probable cause or not, and if so, you'll allow us to do it. And in that setting, there's no need, really, for the other side to be represented. When judges issue search warrants, there's no other side. The police officer comes in, says, I have probable cause, the judge agrees or disagrees, issues the warrant, and that's the end of the matter. And so that's what the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that's how it envisioned the FISC operating. But over the course of 30 plus years, what's happened is that the law has changed, technology has changed dramatically, and occasionally the FISA court has before it really difficult, complex legal constitutional issues about whether a particular program should be authorized. The Section 215 metadata program is a classic example of that. That's not a probable cause judgment. That's a question of, does the statute and does the Fourth Amendment allow the government to engage in this? And on those issues, we argued that there needs to be an independent advocate who represents the privacy, civil liberties issues on those kinds of questions before the FISC. Now, that advocate has to be within the realm of classification, has to have top secret clearance, can't go around telling people what they learned, but that other side needs to be represented as part of the manifestation of the adversary system that we generally rely upon. The president accepted that recommendation, although he structured it slightly differently from the way we recommended. We recommended that there be a person who would decide herself when it was necessary to intervene. Whereas the president accepted the view of Judge Bates, who'd been the chief judge of the FISA court, that instead the judges should decide whether there was a need for intervention by the advocate. We think that was a mistake, but the president went 90% the way there. One other point I'll make about the FISA court, and then I'll stop, is one of the things that came to light, it was always there on Wikipedia, nobody ever looked at it. One of the things that came to light after the Snowden revelations and people started looking at the FISA court is that, as I said at the outset, the Chief Justice decides who sits on the court. Right? Now, since the FISA court was created, we've had 3 Chief Justices: Warren Burger, William Rehnquist, and John Roberts. Burger and Rehnquist appointed a reasonable distribution of judges on the FISA court. That is, they appointed judges who've been appointed by Democratic presidents as well as by Republican presidents. Since John Roberts has been Chief Justice, he appointed all of the current 11 judges on the court, 10 of which had been appointed by Republican presidents. And I have to say that Roberts could have thought this appropriate is simply mind-boggling, given that it's not secret, right? You would think both in terms of meeting your responsibilities substantively, that you would know you want a court that more or less reflects the diversity of the federal judiciary. And in terms of the integrity of the FISA court, you'd want a court that is understood to reflect that view. And in terms of your own personal integrity, you'd think you would not do this. Yet it's what Roberts did. So we recommended that, unfortunately, we think this is a perfectly sound way to pick the judges. But unfortunately, given the way Chief Justice Roberts dealt with it, it's a problem. So we recommended instead, after a lot of thought, there's no good answer to this. You don't want the president to do it. You don't want Congress to do it because you want to depoliticize it. That's the whole point. So we recommended that each justice should be able to appoint a circuit judge. Each justice is assigned responsibility for one of the 12 circuits in the United States, so each one would be able to appoint a judge from each of the circuits who would be on the FISA court. So you'd spread their appointment power around among all the justices. Obama did not mention this in his speech. I suspect partly because Roberts isn't going to keep doing this now. I mean, he'd have to be a complete moron to keep doing this now. And I'm told that his next appointment, which hasn't yet been made public, will be someone who is appointed by a Democratic president, and future Chief Justices are likely to learn the lesson from this. So it may be that this is self-correcting, having been hopefully humiliated by the disclosure of his misbehavior. Okay, so with that, let me stop, and I'll be happy to take questions. You don't get. Maybe you already mentioned this. By the way, this is a good read. I highly recommend it. I want to say, we wrote this for people to read. It was not written for the president. It was written for you. And we very self-consciously made the decision we were not going to write a classified report. We wanted it to be public, and we wanted it to be readable. In fact, Princeton University Press is publishing it in a month or so, but it's available online. Sorry.
Part about an advocate being part of the decision-making. My understanding, just from reading in the news, maybe or maybe it's more complicated, but I'm hearing something about that if the court determined that this was a security issue that was too vital for an advocate to get involved, they could say, "No, sorry, we don't want you on this particular case."
No, I don't think that's not what anybody is. Everything that the FISC does is classified by definition. So, and there are lawyers who work, with the Department of Justice who make the cases for the FISC. The advocate would have the same security clearance as any of the other lawyers that operate with the FISC. So I don't think that's anybody's understanding. Shouldn't be, and I don't think it is. So these advocates, if once created, would have the same access to the information as would any other Department of Justice lawyer arguing on the other side. Right. So in the private sector, it's quite clear that Google and Yahoo and Amazon, I mean, they know everything about all of us, right? In all sorts of ways, far more intrusive than anything that the NSA ever gets its hands on. And the question is, well, how do we deal with that? Well, that of course was not part of our charge, and that is an appropriate matter for legislation. The key question is, what do the American people want? Right? I mean, many people see that as a positive because they like getting information about things they wouldn't have thought of otherwise because somebody knows about them and knows their interests. Other people think it's a horrible invasion of their privacy. So basically it's a political legislative issue that I think we do need to address, which we haven't really addressed in a serious way given the change in technology over the last 10 to 20 years. I think it's just a basically straight-up question of would people rather have what many people see as the benefit of this, getting these notices on Facebook and on email that tell them about products that they might be interested in, or would they rather go back to a world in which nobody knows what they're doing, nobody knows anything about them, or is there a middle ground in there? But I do think that's a serious subject, and privacy groups are very concerned about this and have tried to come up with draft legislation to deal with it. So I think it's a serious question, but it does pose an interesting judgment about which is better. Now, the other way to do it, of course, is to allow the data to be held, but to have criminal penalties on misuse of the data, and then define what you mean by misuse. So that's another way of going that tries to balance the two interests. That says you can use it for certain purposes, but not for other purposes. So you can't make it public. You can't just put it out there that what you learn about somebody in this way, or you can't give it to somebody's enemy, or you can't use it to blackmail them. So there are all sorts of middle grounds that one could possibly address. But these were not any of the issues that we ourselves had to deal with. Happily. Well, it would be
My trust level in the FBI
right.
somewhere below Vladimir Putin.
Well, you and Richard Clark, I have to say, share that view. In our first meeting with the FBI, we met with about 15 sort of senior people, each of whom was going to do a kind of show and tell. And after about 40 minutes, Clark got up and said, "This is bullshit," and let us out of the room, somewhat abashed on my part, but it was supposed to be a 6-hour meeting. So he does share a view with the FBI. He refers to them as knuckle draggers. I don't endorse that. That's his view. First of all, NSL is unconstitutional. Well, subpoenas are not. Right? Subpoenas have long been accepted as constitutional. NSLs are not broader than subpoenas. That is, in general, they follow the same basic breadth that subpoenas are supposed to follow. So the fundamental question is it different if a prosecutor issues a subpoena than if the FBI section chief issues an NSL? And there are arguments on both sides of that. The primary argument, in my view, that suggests the NSL is problematic is the secrecy. And that's why we thought a court order should be required. Would it withstand a Fourth Amendment challenge? Don't know. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. No, you don't need. Okay, that's a deeper question. You don't need probable. This is under the Fourth Amendment, long settled, right? You don't need probable cause for subpoena, right? So because you're not rummaging around in somebody's home or drawer or whatever, you're asking for specific information, you don't need probable cause to get a subpoena. And so it's always been understood to be different from an ordinary search. There are limitations on it. It has to be reasonable in scope and breadth and so on, but that's pretty flexible. So unless one's prepared to get rid of subpoenas, the probable cause has never been required for the use of a subpoena.
Jeff, let's take Snowden out of it. Russia and China and so on. Let's same disclosures have been made and will be made. Is that, in your view, a good thing or a bad thing?
So that's obviously a hard question because it has both good and bad elements to it. Okay, the good element to it is that I believe it has proved to be a productive and positive thing that we're able to have this discussion about this issue. On the other hand, and the media reports on this have all focused exclusively on that this is good, we can talk about it, it's a good thing that we as a democracy can make this decision among ourselves, and so on and so forth. The bad thing about it is severalfold. First, even with respect to Section 215 in the metadata program, looking only at that, let's assume that's the sole question, right? The downside of the revelation of it is that terrorists now know that we're doing this. And presumably, in 2014, instead of there being 288 terrorists who call into the United States where we can track them, there may be 12. And we will therefore lose the ability to connect those dots, right? Now, one can say, it doesn't matter, it didn't prove to be useful anyway. But you can't quite take that to the extreme because it might be useful. So the flip side of the argument is that even under Section 215, this undoubtedly will have a significant effect on the effectiveness of the program itself. And so imagine for the moment that Section 215 in 2012 had thwarted 2 terrorist attacks. Right? It didn't, but let's imagine it did. Right? Now going from 288 to 12 really is a concern. Right? So even on Section 215, these are incommensurable things. It's very hard to balance. Is it unbalanced good or bad? But it's much more complicated than just saying because it's a benefit, it's good. Now, if you go beyond Section 215, Snowden revealed a huge amount of information that goes far beyond the things that Americans are particularly interested in because it involves foreign intelligence outside the United States, which has infuriated other countries. Those are all legal under American law. And that has devastating consequences in a whole variety of ways. Economically, it's had serious consequences to American internet providers. It's had serious consequences in terms of the ability to use programs that previously had been very useful, unlike Section 215, which become revealed. So from that perspective, it's easy to make a pretty strong case that outside 215, the benefit from the disclosure to Americans is much less, and the harm is much greater. So I think it's a hard question, but it's not easy. It's not like, oh, goody, now we know this, and that's all we have to look at. There's the other side of it, and the other side is very real. And one thing I became convinced of is that there are real costs to a lot of these, particularly the foreign disclosures.
On that, was there international
Yes, we met on several occasions with representatives of the EU. At one point with 25 people from the EU, and another time with about a dozen, and we had half-day meetings on each occasion. So we had a lot of input from them. Yeah.
Her charge specifically was to evaluate issues. Should we be analogous committee that's evaluating independently the legal questions, or is there?
Well, for one thing, there are federal courts who are now looking at it. Since it's now become public, 2 different federal district court judges have addressed the question of Section 215. One held it was constitutional, one held it was unconstitutional. So once it's public, you don't need that. But before that, of course, the FISA court, on 35 different occasions, upheld the legality and constitutionality of the telephony metadata program. And the Justice Department and the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee all had independently concluded that it was both legal and constitutional. Legal meaning within the statute and constitutional. My own view of that is I think it's not within the scope of Section 215. I think it goes beyond what Section 215 intended to authorize, which was something much more like a subpoena, a conventional subpoena, not the the collection of vast amounts of metadata. You couldn't do that in a subpoena. So my own view is that the program probably is not authorized by the statute. On the constitutional question, it's more complicated. There's a lot of doctrines that interweave here that are kind of messy. But my own view would be to say that it is an unreasonable search as long as the three conditions that we agreed on are not satisfied, so that it's unconstitutional as it currently exists. But it could be brought in conformity with the Fourth Amendment. That would be my view.
Can I ask two little process questions about your security?
So on the first question, I would have been completely suspicious about that, but for the fact that two of our members were Richard Clark and Michael Morell. And they would never stand for anyone bullshitting them. And they accepted their responsibility in this review group completely. So on that, I was quite confident that we were hearing everything that we needed to hear because they were present. And they would have called the question immediately if they had the slightest doubt that anybody was operating, which is what Clark did when he walked out of the FBI meeting, frankly. This is bullshit. We're not going to listen to this. So yeah, I do believe we learned everything that we asked for. Now, did we always ask all the right questions? Not necessarily. When you're dealing with very complicated stuff you don't know a lot about, even Clark and Morell didn't know a lot about some of these things. You couldn't always be sure you were asked all the right questions. But we're five pretty smart people, pretty good lawyers. I think we probably did a reasonable job about that. But here's a question we didn't ask, and I just learned about 2 weeks ago, which is really fascinating to me. So I gave the hypothetical about the telephony metadata program, that there's 100 calls and 100, and they've got 10,000, okay, for a single one. So for 288, you'd have maybe 288 times 10,000, right? It turns out that the 288 queries that were done in 2012 touched only 6,000 phone numbers. Totally counterintuitive. The reason for that is people suspected of terrorism in Pakistan don't call many people. And the people they call don't call many people because they're not calling you or me, right? So it turns out that the actual number of numbers that even were touched by the queries was tiny compared to what I had imagined. I'd imagined millions, right? 6,000. And we didn't think to ask that question because we just made the assumption that it must be 100 times 100 times 100 or whatever. So that's an example of not asking the right question. And in this case, at least, discovering something that would have been much worse if we thought it was 6,000 and it turned out to be a million. And we made recommendations as we did. But that was a really interesting thing to discover. So the second part of the question was?
Did anybody challenge or question the president about not choosing a woman for one of the 5 members?
Well, we became known in the White House as the 5 white guys. So, wasn't it for us to challenge it? There were people outside who certainly raised the question of why isn't there a woman? Why isn't there a person of color? Why isn't there a full-time professional technologist? The president wanted a small group, and he was right in that. And I think he was not so concerned about diversity. He wanted 5 people who he thought would do a really good job. And of course, all the people we were reporting to, by the way, were women, except for the president. In fact, we were reporting to an African American, Susan Rice, Kathy Rumler, and Lisa Monaco. So everybody we reported to was either the president, an African American, or 3 women. So they were there.
Did you not have the staff?
Good question. We had a great staff. We had a staff of 9 individuals, full-time. They were tasked from the various agencies. So they were from NSA, CIA, FBI, ODNI, Director of National Intelligence, and they were great. They were completely devoted, 7 in the morning, 9 at night, every day. I could not give more praise. They just did everything that we needed and wanted, and they did it in good humor and efficiently, and they were great. And I want to say, that actually raises something else I do think it's important to say. When I went into this, being the sort of ACS, ACLU guy, I had all the same suspicions about the NSA that any of you would probably have. And I came away from this with an incredible degree of admiration and respect for the professionalism and the integrity of the NSA. These are real professionals, and they are committed to doing their job within the law correctly. We found no instance, not a single one, of any illegality on the part of NSA. The problems were that the Congress and the executive and the judiciary gave them authorities that we thought maybe they shouldn't have given them. But the NSA itself was pretty scrupulous about being careful and staying within the rules. When they screwed up, they brought it to the FISA court and said, we screwed up. These guys and women are military in the best sense of the word. And one of the things that really upset me during this process, I have to say, was having gotten to see them and know them a bit. These are people who could earn 10 times as much money in the private sector. They're really talented tech people, right? And they're doing this because they're protecting the nation. And the extent to which they became mocked and the subject of really awful mischaracterization and demoralization. I had several conversations with Keith Alexander, the director of NSA, about this dilemma for them of demoralization within the ranks. That was really painful to see, because I really did come to have great respect and admiration for these people, and they were really being raked over the coals and called rogue and lawless and everything else. And if I can pick a bone with the ACLU, Anthony Romero, who's a good friend of mine, sent me an email after he read the report saying, much better than I expected. This is terrific. I like a lot of it, and so on and so forth. And I had recently seen the video that ACLU had put out around Christmas time it was based on there's a cartoon based on the song, You Better Watch Out, you know, and it was Santa Claus is watching or whatever, and it was the NSA dressed as Santa Claus. And I was really upset by it. And I said to Anthony, you know, I thanks for the compliments. I appreciate it, but I got to tell you, I was really put off. And I explained to him what I said to you a moment ago about my view of the people in the NSA and so on. And he said, yeah, but we got millions of hits. I said, that's not the point, Anthony. That's not the point, right? But I did. I mean, being in this cave, you get to see things in a way you never imagined. And one of the things I came away with is this great, real admiration for the people at NSA. They're really professionals. It's time for, what time is it? Time for the last question, I guess?
Yeah, to get back to something even that precedes talking about with the process, just curious how NSA, CIA, whoever, how do they define terrorism to begin with? And I'll give you an example of that. Much on email or internet, you're basically just talking about phones. But, you know, I've been really reticent the last several years about what I look up on the internet. Like, I've been very scared of even emailing or Googling anything about Yemen. Or I remember a few years ago, The Nation did a story on how to make an A-bomb. I've been curious as hell about that. How do they pick up the information and decide what constitutes terrorism to begin with? When they start looking after these phone numbers, and also when they do find these, is there any safeguards against using them for alternative purposes, such as if on a phone call, you know, they got you nailed or suspected for something of a terrorist nature, but on one of your phone calls or one of your emails, you happen to mention to your friend Joe, hey man, you got any weed I can score by this weekend? Can they then shift that to another department and run that list?
Okay, the first thing to understand is the NSA does not look at any emails or texts or phone call content at all, unless there is probable cause in a warrant. So,
How do they determine?
Well, the same way you do with any other crime. The same way you do with any other crime. But they can't do it by just looking at the content of your messages. They do not look at that, period. And so they are not reading Americans' emails. They're not listening to the content of their phone calls. They're not looking at your internet searches. They're not authorized to do that, and they don't do that, right? Unless they have probable cause, the same way a police department would, right? In that sense, for foreign intelligence purposes, they have to get a warrant from the FISA court to do that based on probable cause. And how do they get probable cause? The same way anybody else gets probable cause, but you can't do it by having illegal searches. So that's the first thing. Where these issues do arise, however, is the NSA is allowed to have much greater surveillance of foreign persons outside the United States. So to the extent the NSA wants to listen in to a phone call or listen in or read an email exchange between someone in Pakistan and someone in Afghanistan, they do not need probable cause and a warrant for that. Right? They need reasonable suspicion that the person they're targeting is outside the United States, is a non-U.S. person, and is engaged in terrorist activities. And they don't need a warrant, right? Because the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to any of that. So the statute, this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, in Section 702, prohibits the government from doing that unless they have reasonable grounds to believe that the person they are targeting is a non-U.S. person, is outside the United States, and is engaged in terrorist activities. That's a lower standard than would be possible in the United States for anybody, or even outside the United States for an American. Okay? Even outside the United States, they can't listen to your phone calls or tap your emails if you're an American citizen. So now what happens, though, is sometimes the person in Pakistan is talking to somebody in the United States, right? And if they're legally reading their emails, where the target is the person in Pakistan, they're going to see the emails back and forth with his brother-in-law who lives in Chicago, right? And the question is, well, what do you do with that, right? Now, in some sense, this is similar to what happens whenever you have a legal wiretap. When you have a legal wiretap, the person you're tapping is going to have phone calls with lots of people who aren't involved in the criminal activities, right? So the general rule is you can't keep the data. So when any of the surveillance activities that the NSA engages in of non-U.S. persons who are outside the United States, where there's reasonable grounds to believe they're engaged in terrorism, whenever that picks up, incidentally, an American, right? The rules are once you identify it as American, you have to destroy the data unless it's relevant to a foreign intelligence investigation or another serious criminal act. Then you can, otherwise you have to get rid of it. And so the problem with that, just to be clear, is that there's a lot of this information. And the FBI or the NSA does not look at every single email to see who the person on the other end is. By the way, all this is picked up in the United States, just so you understand it. They're not going to Pakistan, right? The Pakistani internet goes through the United States. And so when they do this, they're just doing it here, monitoring a particular email address because they've met the standard. So the problem is that there's a lot of that data. And they don't look through every single one of millions of emails that are touched to see whether the person on the other end, who's not the target, happens to be an American. The email address may be Gmail. They don't know who the hell the person is, right? It's not easy to find out who they are. So what happens is when they know it's an American, they have to destroy it.
How do we know they're destroying it?
I can't say that I went in and saw the information being destroyed, okay? But I'm persuaded that they do this, that they do it. The bigger problem, though, is do they search the data for Americans? So suppose, for example, they learn that the brother-in-law in Chicago might be a drug dealer. I don't know, but might be a drug dealer. Can they then search for that person's email in this database they have to get the content of his email exchanges, right? To see whether he's admitting to his relative in Pakistan that he deals drugs. And we recommend that they're not allowed to search that database for any American. And that's not the current law. The current law is you can use that information if you learn that it's there. We said you cannot search it unless there's probable cause and a warrant. So if you go to a court and get probable cause and a warrant that Joe in Chicago, who is part of this now database because he's talking to his brother-in-law in Pakistan, you have to get probable cause and a warrant. Then you can go in and look at the emails, but not otherwise. That was not a recommendation the president commented on, so we don't know what he's going to do with that. Thank you all very much for coming.